Welcome to the show. We've got a great show today. A couple of days ago, I saw one of my favorite knife makers on YouTube, Walter Sorrells. If you're not familiar with his channel, go check it out. He does some incredible work. But he did something I haven't seen before. He gave himself 2 hours to make a knife. So I figured I would attempt the same thing. Now, he did a fantastic job with his knife. It was forged from a rod of D2 tool steel. He gave it a wooden handle with a hidden tang. Really great work. I'm going to take a little bit simpler approach on the knife. I'll be forging this from a scrap of 1/8 inch bar stock. And as you can see, the handle is essentially integral, which will definitely save me some time. But in my defense, Walter Sorrells did not make a sheath for his knife. Also, he has about 25 more years of experience than I do making knives. So one of the things I've learned since I started knife making a few months ago is that quality steel can actually be quite expensive. So it really pays to make the best use you can out of the steel you have. And sometimes you wind up with a length that's just not quite right for the project you're trying to do. So I had a piece of bar stock that was, I think, 18 inches. And I used part of it to make a knife. Then I had this funny end left over, and I had a length that was just an off length, maybe 12 or 13 inches. And to make a full-size knife, you really need about 8 or 9 inches. So once I had that part cut out, I was just left with this, 4 inches or so of a kind of funny-shaped piece of steel. Obviously not enough material here to make a full-size knife, but just about perfect for a neck knife. Now there's a few different handle designs I was thinking of when I went into this, but the one I kept coming back to was a look that I often see with a forged knife, where you have a long drawn-out tang that gets curled back around on itself and forms a handle. You'll see this in some larger knives, but I also think it's a pretty good look for a small knife like a neck knife, especially since many neck knives are designed without a very large or very thick handle for obvious reasons. Since I was working on limited time, I really didn't want to start up the charcoal forge and wait for that thing to come up to temperature. So I decided to cut out sort of a long, thin tang that I could heat just with a propane torch and straighten it and draw it out without having to get the whole forge going. But as you can see, my little propane torch really wasn't enough to bring this thing up to proper heat. And I wound up trying to work it while it was too cold. And I broke the end off of the tang. Now at this point, I was already close to 30 minutes into the project. And I basically had the choice of admitting defeat and starting over from scratch, or quickly rethinking this design and just doing the best I could to make this into a functional knife. It didn't take me too long to realize that I still had enough material left here to at least make a pretty good one-finger grip. And as you'll see, the design actually evolved into essentially a 2-finger grip, although it might be a little bit of a tight fit for somebody with larger hands. I also made up my mind at this point that I was done with that little propane torch, so I busted out the big guns with the oxyacetylene. But if you don't happen to have one of these in your shop, you definitely could use one of those cheap propane torches like I was using before. But you just have to be a little bit more patient and let the metal really heat up properly before you try to work it. I will say, though, that if you do have the ability to bring the steel up to a nice, bright red, it's going to be a lot easier to work, and you're going to save yourself a lot of frustration. So once I had that shaped more or less the way I wanted it, I just had to rough out the shape of the blade. Decided to go with a drop point and to make the blade a little bit skinnier than what I had originally planned. It seemed like with a smaller tang, just to provide proper visual balance, I had to take the dimensions of the blade down accordingly. As you see here, I started work on a sort of second finger notch with the metal file. And I probably would have preferred to do this that way if I had more time. But I quickly realized that with the clock running, I needed to go back to power tools. So I switched over to the Dremel, and that actually went really well. And with that done, I brought it over to the 1x30 belt grinder. And I had a fairly fine grit belt on there. I forget what it was. I think it was 120 grit. And it was a little bit worn. I thought about switching to a more aggressive grit, but again, running against a clock, I don't know, I felt like I was going to lose a little bit too much time if I started switching belts on this thing. In the end, it took me a little bit longer to get the bevel I wanted because I was using that finer grit belt, and that of course makes the blade heat up faster, and so I'm going back and forth to the water with it. And This actually worked pretty well, but I think if I had it to do over, I think I would actually take the time to switch to the coarser grit. Because in the end, I'm not really sure if it saved any time, and I think it would have been easier to define the bevel if I had a coarser grit belt on there. But things still worked out pretty well. I think the key here was just to take a little bit more time than I maybe wanted to, because every time I tried to hurry the process, it seemed like I screwed up the bevel, and I had to go back and take the time to straighten things out and fix it up. There are some parts of the process you really can't rush, and I think putting in a good bevel is one of those. So once I had the edge tapered down to about 1/16 of an inch, I fired up the torch again, brought the steel up to a nice bright cherry red, and brought it back to quench it in my super old and disgusting vegetable oil. I would say that I really need to change that oil, except I'm not cooking with it. I mean, I'm just quenching steel, so I guess it can be old and disgusting. It still works. As I've mentioned before, it's a good idea to wear gloves when you do this process because you often will get a fire. And if something splashed just wrong, I mean, you can imagine that boiling, burning oil could make a pretty good mess out of your skin. So definitely wear gloves. So after the quench, I took a quick look at the blade. Didn't see any warps or cracks, for which I was very thankful because I'm about an hour into the project at this point. And so then I quickly brought this over to my super high-tech tempering furnace, also known as a Walmart toaster oven. And then I started to get things positioned for making the sheath. Now in a second here, you're going to see that I stopped the timer. You may think that's cheating, but since Walter Sorrells is the guy who invented this 2-hour knife making challenge, and he stopped the timer for his tempering process, I felt like that was within the rules of this challenge. Rest assured, however, I did not do any work on the project while the timer was stopped. Well, now that I think of it, I may have switched the Kydex press from one table to another. But that really only took about 5 seconds, so I'm not going to count that against me. So, with the tempering done, I started up the timer again and got to work on the sheath. Now, for anybody who has seen a Kydex press in action, this is all pretty straightforward. I set the oven to about 325, 350. I'll lay the Kydex right down on the rack in there and leave it in for about 5 minutes. It's a good idea to have your press ready to go because when you pull the Kydex out of the oven, you really only have maybe 10 or 20 seconds to get things positioned so that you can press it into place before it will have cooled too far. But other than that, the only real key is just to make sure that you have things positioned the way you want them. And remember that you can trim a lot of this off later. So I've found that it's better to start with more Kydex than you think you need, just to give yourself that little extra margin of error to work with. Of course, if I had a little more time, I'd probably spend some time on the buffing wheel, getting that edge of the sheath done really nicely, but under the circumstances, I decided having a functional sheath and a functional knife was probably more important than having that last little bit of fit and finish on it. So with the sheath done, all I really had left to do was sharpen up the knife. And for this, I went back to the belt grinder. I found that I can put a pretty good edge on there, at least enough to cut paper, not really shaving sharp. But considering that I only have about 20 minutes left at this point, I felt that the quick and dirty approach was probably better than getting out the stones and going for a razor's edge. So there it is, the finished knife and sheath, and I actually had a few minutes to spare. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this video and maybe got something out of it. I know I learned a lot on the project. I think sometimes it's good to work against a deadline because it really forces me to think through what my priorities are and what takes more time, what takes less time, how to get something done quickly versus how to get something done well. And if I'd had more time, yeah, I could have taken another hour or two and worked on this or that and gotten things fitted up a little better or finished a little nicer. But it's nice to know that if you break a project down just to bare bones, you can produce a perfectly functional knife with a sheath included in less than 2 hours. So thanks for watching the video. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. And whoever you are, whatever you're doing, have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video.